Most people believe they are defending their values, their personality, their character, their true self. Marcus Aurelius would have seen something else. He would have seen a defense of identity. Not identity as essence, but identity as construction. A collection of habits, stories, preferences, emotional patterns. Most suffering does not come from events. It comes from the need to protect this construction. Every time you feel offended, something inside you is being threatened. Every time you feel defensive, something fragile is being touched. This is not weakness, it is attachment. You are attached to an idea of who you are, and attachment creates fear. Fear of being misunderstood, fear of being diminished, fear of being wrong. Marcus Aurelius wrote not to express himself, but to dissolve himself. He reminded himself repeatedly that the self he experiences is not solid. It is temporary, changeable, unstable, and because it is unstable, defending it creates tension. You react not because something is wrong, but because something feels threatened, a role, a belief, an image. Most people do not realize how much energy they spend maintaining consistency. Consistency between what they believe about themselves and what they show the world. When this consistency is challenged, the mind reacts, not thoughtfully, automatically. This is why criticism feels personal, not because it is accurate, but because it shakes identity. Marcus Aurelius believed that peace begins when you stop treating identity as something that must be defended, because what is real does not need defense. Only constructions do. The identity you protect today was not the same one you had years ago, and it will not be the same one you have later, yet you defend it as if it were permanent. This contradiction creates strain. You hold tightly to something that is always changing, and then you wonder why it feels unstable. Stoicism does not ask you to destroy identity. It asks you to see through it, to recognize it as a tool, not a truth. When identity becomes absolute, every interaction becomes a threat. Every disagreement becomes conflict. Every difference becomes danger. This is exhausting. Marcus Aurelius understood that the mind becomes calm only when it stops demanding consistency from something that is inherently fluid. In the next part, we will explore why the ego constantly seeks proof and why identity cannot survive without constant reinforcement. Pause here. Notice what you feel compelled to defend. The ego is not loud by nature. It becomes loud when it feels uncertain. Marcus Aurelius understood that the ego is not a monster to be destroyed. It is a signal that identity feels unstable and is seeking reinforcement. The ego constantly asks for proof. Proof that you matter, proof that you are competent, proof that you are right, not because you are arrogant, but because the image you carry is fragile. Anything fragile needs support. So the mind looks outward. It looks for approval, agreement, recognition, and when these are missing, discomfort appears. Marcus Aurelius observed this pattern in himself. He noticed how quickly the mind reacts when it feels overlooked, how easily irritation arises when expectations are unmet, not because the event is significant, but because identity is involved. The ego needs proof because identity is not self-sustaining. It is built from memory, comparison, and habit. It exists only as long as it is reinforced. When someone challenges your view, the ego feels diminished. When someone succeeds where you fail, the ego feels threatened. When someone ignores you, the ego feels erased. These reactions feel personal, but they are mechanical. The mind is protecting a structure that cannot stand on its own. Marcus Aurelius believed that what requires constant proof cannot be essential. Essence does not demand validation. It simply exists. The ego, by contrast, is always negotiating. It compares, it measures, it defends, and comparison is exhausting. When identity depends on proof, peace becomes conditional. You feel calm only when affirmed, confident only when praised, stable only when unchallenged. This creates dependence. Dependence on circumstances you do not control. Marcus Aurelius warned himself against this dependence. He reminded himself that worth is not something granted externally. It is something recognized internally. But recognition requires detachment. Detachment from constant self-evaluation. The ego resists this detachment because it fears disappearance. It fears that without proof, there will be nothing left. But what disappears is not the self. It is the illusion. In the next part, we will examine how emotional reactions function as identity defense, and why feelings often rise precisely when identity feels threatened. Pause here. Notice where you seek proof that you are enough. Emotions are often treated as spontaneous reactions to life, as something that simply happens. Marcus Aurelius saw them differently. He saw emotions as responses, not events, and more specifically, as defenses. When identity feels threatened, emotion rises to protect it. Anger appears when authority is questioned. Defensiveness appears when self-image is challenged. Shame appears when identity feels exposed. These emotions feel immediate and personal, but they are not random. They are protective mechanisms. Marcus Aurelius observed that the mind reacts most intensely when it feels seen, not seen in a flattering way, but seen accurately. This is why truth often feels aggressive, not because it is delivered harshly, but because it bypasses the story you tell about yourself. When identity is stable, feedback passes through easily. When identity is fragile, every comment feels like an attack. The emotion rises to block penetration, to prevent reevaluation, to maintain the image intact. This is why arguments escalate so quickly. People are not defending ideas, they are defending selves. Once emotion takes over, reason is no longer the goal. Protection is. Marcus Aurelius warned himself never to mistake emotional intensity for truth. Strong emotion does not mean something is right. It means something feels threatened. The mind uses emotion to regain control of the narrative. Anger narrows focus. Fear accelerates reaction. Pride hardens position. All of these limit reflection, which is exactly their function. They protect identity by preventing examination. This is why emotional reactions feel urgent. They demand immediate action. They do not ask questions. They close them. Marcus Aurelius practiced slowing this process, not by suppressing emotion, but by observing it, by asking, "What is this protecting?" This question changes everything. Once you see emotion as defense, its authority weakens. You no longer ask, "Why do I feel this?" You ask, "What am I afraid of losing?" Often, the answer is simple. An image, a role, a belief about yourself. And once you see that, the emotion loosens its grip. In the next part, we will explore why criticism feels like an attack and how identity transforms disagreement into threat. Pause here. Notice the last time you reacted strongly. Ask yourself quietly, what part of me felt endangered? Criticism rarely hurts because it is accurate. It hurts because it touches identity. Marcus Aurelius understood that the pain of criticism does not come from the words themselves, but from what those words threaten. When someone criticizes you, the mind does not hear information. It hears danger. Danger to the image you hold. Danger to the role you play. Danger to the story that keeps you coherent. If identity were flexible, criticism would be useful. It would pass through, leaving insight behind. But when identity is rigid, criticism feels invasive, not because it is violent, but because it forces reevaluation. And reevaluation is what the ego resists most. Marcus Aurelius believed that offense is not taken. It is granted. The mind decides whether something has the power to injure it, and this decision depends on attachment. When you are attached to being seen as competent, any suggestion of failure feels humiliating. When you are attached to being moral, any accusation feels intolerable. When you are attached to being right, any disagreement feels disrespectful. The stronger the attachment, the stronger the reaction. This is why two people can hear the same criticism and respond completely differently. One pauses, the other explodes. The difference is not temperament. It is identity investment. Marcus Aurelius practiced reducing this investment, not by becoming indifferent, but by becoming less identified. He reminded himself that opinions are not essence. Mistakes are not identity. Feedback is not a verdict. This allowed him to listen without collapsing. Most people cannot do this because they confuse evaluation of behavior with evaluation of worth. When behavior is criticized, the ego hears, "You are insufficient," so it defends, with explanation, with justification, with counterattack, anything to restore the threatened image. But this defense comes at a cost. Learning stops, insight is blocked, and the same patterns repeat. Marcus Aurelius believed that growth requires the ability to be wrong without being diminished. This ability is rare because it requires loosening the grip on who you think you are. In the next part, we will anchor this understanding directly in Stoic philosophy and explore Marcus Aurelius on the false self. Pause here. Notice what criticism you avoid most. Marcus Aurelius did not write to define himself. He wrote to dissolve false definitions. Again and again he reminded himself that what he experiences as self is not a solid thing. It is a process. Thoughts arise, judgments form, impressions pass, and the mistake most people make is to cling to these impressions as if they were permanent identity. Marcus Aurelius warned himself never to confuse appearance with essence. The role you play is not who you are. The reputation you carry is not who you are. The story you repeat is not who you are. These are surfaces, useful but unstable. The false self is built from accumulation, praise collected, criticism avoided, comparisons remembered. Over time, this accumulation hardens into an image, and once the image exists, it demands protection. This is the source of most inner conflict. The false self wants consistency. Reality offers change. The false self wants control. Life offers uncertainty. The false self wants validation. The world offers indifference. Marcus Aurelius understood that suffering arises not because life is hostile, but because identity is brittle. He trained himself to see through the false self, not to destroy it, but to stop obeying it. He reminded himself that nothing essential is harmed by opinion, that nothing real is threatened by misunderstanding. Only the image suffers, and the image was never stable. This realization is unsettling, because it removes the familiar anchor of who I am. But it also removes fear. If identity is not fixed, it does not need constant defense. You can be wrong without being diminished. You can change without betraying yourself. You can let go without disappearing. Marcus Aurelius believed that freedom begins where identification ends. Not indifference to life, but freedom from constant self-reference. When the self is no longer the center, clarity returns. Events become events, not judgments of worth. Feedback becomes information, not threat. Emotion becomes signal, not command. This is what the Stoics meant by inner freedom, not withdrawal from life, but release from illusion. In the next part, we will explore what remains when identity falls away and why this absence feels frightening at first, but peaceful over time. Pause here. Notice how tightly you hold to the idea of yourself. When identity loosens its grip, the first thing you feel is not freedom. It is absence, a strange quiet where familiar reference points used to be. Marcus Aurelius understood this well. He knew that when the stories about the self fall silent, the mind initially feels unanchored. No label to lean on, no image to protect, no role to perform. This absence feels unsettling because the mind is used to defining itself. Without definition, it does not know where to stand. Many people turn back at this point. They rush to rebuild identity, to reclaim certainty, to restore the familiar tension, because tension feels like substance. But Marcus Aurelius stayed. He observed what remained when the false self softened, and what remained was not emptiness, it was clarity, awareness without commentary, attention without judgment, presence without defense. Without identity constantly interpreting events, experience becomes simpler. Things happen, responses arise, actions follow. But there is less internal noise, less argument, less narration. Marcus Aurelius discovered that the self was not a thing to be protected, but a function, a way of orienting. And when that function relaxed, life did not collapse, it stabilized. Without identity demanding validation, praise lost its power. Without identity fearing exposure, criticism softened. Without identity insisting on coherence, change became natural. This is why the absence feels frightening at first, because fear was tied to identity. When identity fades, fear loses structure. What remains is attention, and attention is steady, not dramatic, not exciting, but reliable. Marcus Aurelius believed that this state was the closest thing to peace, not happiness, not pleasure, peace, a mind that does not need to explain itself. This peace is not achieved by force. It appears when unnecessary defense stops, when the mind no longer treats experience as a verdict on who you are. In the next part, we will explore how to live without a fixed self-image and why this flexibility feels dangerous, yet deeply liberating. Pause here. Sit with the quiet. Living without a fixed self-image sounds unsettling to most people. If you are not a defined person, who are you? Marcus Aurelius understood this fear. He knew that identity feels like ground, something solid to stand on. But he also knew that this ground is unstable. It shifts with opinion, with memory, with circumstance. Living without a fixed self-image does not mean becoming empty. It means becoming flexible. When you no longer insist on being a certain kind of person, you stop defending roles. You stop reacting to protect reputation. You stop clinging to consistency. This does not make you weak. It makes you adaptable. Marcus Aurelius believed that rigidity is the true fragility. A rigid identity cracks under pressure. A flexible mind adjusts. Without a fixed self-image, you can change your mind without humiliation. You can admit error without collapse. You can evolve without feeling like you have betrayed yourself. Most suffering comes from trying to remain the same in a world that constantly changes. The Stoic does not resist change. He aligns with it. Living without a fixed self-image means you respond to life as it is, not as it threatens your image. You listen more, you argue less, you observe instead of defend. This does not remove individuality. It removes fragility. Marcus Aurelius practiced this by reminding himself that reputation is external, opinion is external, even memory is external. What remains is conduct, how you choose to act in each moment. This is enough. Without identity constantly narrating experience, life becomes lighter. You stop carrying explanations everywhere. You stop editing yourself. You stop rehearsing who you are supposed to be. And in this simplicity, clarity appears. You are no longer trying to be someone. You are simply responding wisely. This is not loss. It is relief. In the final part, we will bring everything together and close with a quiet truth. You are not the story you tell about yourself, and you never needed to be. Pause here. Let the image soften. At some point, something becomes clear, not through effort, not through analysis, but through stillness. The story you tell about yourself is not who you are. It is a narrative, useful, familiar, but not essential. Marcus Aurelius understood that most suffering comes from confusing description with reality. You describe yourself as confident, or anxious, strong, fragile, disciplined, lost, and then you live as if this description were a boundary, as if you must protect it, as if you must remain consistent with it. But consistency is not truth. It is habit. When you loosen your grip on the story, nothing collapses. The world does not disappear. You do not vanish. What disappears is tension, the tension of maintaining an image, the tension of defending a role, the tension of being someone. What remains is simpler: awareness, choice, action. Marcus Aurelius believed that the self was never meant to be an object of obsession. It was meant to be an instrument, something you use, not something you worship. When you stop treating identity as sacred, you gain freedom. Freedom to change, freedom to learn, freedom to respond without fear. You no longer ask, "What does this say about me?" You ask, "What is the right action now?" This question has no story attached to it. It does not require consistency. It does not demand defense. It only asks for clarity. And clarity is always available when you stop narrating. You are not your past reactions. You are not your habitual emotions. You are not the image you protect. You are the capacity to choose how to meet the moment. Marcus Aurelius returned to this idea again and again, not because he forgot, but because the mind drifts back to story. The practice is not to destroy the story. It is to remember that you are not bound by it. As this reflection ends, do not try to redefine yourself. Definitions harden quickly. Instead, allow space. Space between thought and reaction. Space between feeling and identity. Space between experience and story. In that space, something steadier appears. Not a self to defend, but a mind at ease with change. Pause here. And when you return to your life, return lightly. You do not need to carry a story to live with clarity.